Captain Emily Foster stood still in the bustling terminal of New York's JFK Airport, her hand clenched tightly around her boarding pass. After a year-long deployment in the Middle East, the fact that she was finally going home hadn't fully registered yet. The chaos of the terminal, announcements blaring over the loudspeakers, the rush of hurried passengers around her, felt distant, as though she was watching from behind a glass wall. She glanced down at her boarding pass, confirming her flight number and destination. Flight 247 Seattle. Gate B12, it read. Her eyes landed on the small words printed at the top of the ticket. First class. Emily frowned. That couldn't be right. She hadn't bought a first-class ticket. She had been in too much of a rush to get home to think about upgrading. After a year spent on military transports, sitting on hard benches with her fellow soldiers, this was unexpected. She checked again, wondering if the airline had made a mistake. Now boarding first-class passengers for Flight 247 to Seattle. The voice over the speaker crackled. It wasn't a mistake. Emily sighed, tucking the ticket into her pocket. She wasn't going to complain. After the year she'd had, a little extra comfort wouldn't hurt. She made her way to the gate, her military-issued boots echoing softly against the polished floors. She'd gotten used to the sound of them. Heavy, purposeful. Her fatigues felt like armor, shielding her from the world as she stepped onto the jet bridge. But as she crossed the threshold onto the plane, the familiar scent of recycled air hitting her, she was reminded she wasn't in uniform for this flight. She was going home. No more combat gear, no more missions. Inside the first-class cabin, plush seats gleamed under the soft lighting. Emily hesitated for a moment, feeling slightly out of place. She wasn't used to this kind of luxury. The flight attendant greeted her with a warm smile, breaking her thoughts. Welcome aboard, ma'am. Your seat is 1A, just to your left. Emily nodded in thanks and made her way to the seat. She stowed her small carry-on in the overhead compartment, then sank into the comfortable chair. The extra legroom was a relief, a far cry from the cramped military transport she had grown used to. Her body instinctively relaxed, as though finally allowing itself a moment of peace. As passengers continued to board, Emily leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The gentle murmur of conversation, the rustling of luggage being stowed, and the soft hum of the engines soothed her. She was almost able to forget about the tension she carried in her shoulders, the memories of long nights and dangerous missions tugging at the edges of her mind. Just as she was drifting into a light doze, a sharp voice cut through the calm. "Excuse me. I believe you're in my seat." Emily's eyes snapped open, and she sat up, blinking in surprise. A well-dressed man stood in the aisle, glaring down at her with thinly veiled disdain. He looked to be in his late 50s, his graying hair slicked back neatly, his suit crisp and expensive. His eyes flicked to the military patches on her bag, and then up to her face, his expression hardening. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is my seat," Emily said, keeping her voice calm and polite. She reached for her boarding pass, holding it up as proof. Seat 1A. The man's frown deepened, and he looked at her as though she had insulted him. "This is first class," he said, his voice laced with a condescending tone. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. She had faced prejudice before, but it never got easier. She took a deep breath, willing herself to remain composed. "I'm aware," she said, her voice steady. "I was upgraded to this seat. Here's my boarding pass." The man snatched the ticket from her hand, scrutinizing it with narrowed eyes. As if expecting to find a mistake, he handed it back with a scoff. Before the situation could escalate further, a flight attendant appeared by their side, her practiced smile unwavering. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between the two. The man straightened, his chest puffing slightly. "Yes, there certainly is. This woman claims to have a first-class seat, but there must be some kind of mistake." The flight attendant glanced at Emily's boarding pass, then smiled politely. "Everything appears to be in order, sir. Captain Foster is indeed assigned to seat 1. The man's face flushed a deep red. "This is unacceptable," he muttered under his breath. "I paid for this seat, and I won't have my flight ruined by—" "Sir," the flight attendant interrupted, her tone still professional but firm. "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. Captain Foster has a valid first-class ticket, and she has every right to be here. Now, if you'll please find your assigned seat, We need to prepare for takeoff." The man glared at Emily one last time before stomping off toward his own seat. Emily took a deep breath, her heart racing. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, a mix of curiosity and discomfort. She shifted in her seat, feeling exposed. The flight attendant turned back to her, her expression softening. "I'm so sorry about that, Captain. Can I get you anything before we take off?" Emily shook her head. "No, thank you. I'm fine." As the flight attendant walked away, Emily stared out the window, trying to push the encounter from her mind. She had faced far worse during her deployment, but somehow this felt more personal, more unsettling. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about being judged for who she was, for wearing her military service like an invisible badge. The engines roared to life, and the plane began to taxi toward the runway. As the aircraft lifted into the air, Emily watched the ground fall away, the city streets becoming a distant blur. She thought of home, of her family waiting for her in Seattle, and let out a long breath. This was supposed to be her journey back to peace. But as she stared at the clouds outside, she couldn't shake the lingering tension. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this ugly situation into something meaningful. Peter Langston sat rigidly in his seat, his fist clenched tightly in his lap. The embarrassment from his earlier outburst still burned hot in his chest. He stared out of the small window at the clouds, trying to calm himself, but all he could think about was that soldier, Emily Foster, sitting just a few rows ahead of him in first class. He couldn't stop replaying the moment she had handed over her boarding pass, so calm, so steady, while he had made a fool of himself. He had been so sure she didn't belong there, so certain there had been a mistake. But the truth was, the uniform she wore had set him off. His son, Nathan, had worn that same uniform. Peter's jaw tightened as a familiar wave of grief washed over him. Nathan had been just 25 when he was killed in action 2 years ago. Peter remembered the day he got the call, the way the air seemed to leave his lungs as the words sank in. "We regret to inform you." How many times had those words haunted him since then? He blinked away the moisture in his eyes and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Seeing Emily, so composed in her uniform, had brought all that pain back. It wasn't her fault. He knew that. But it didn't stop the anger from bubbling up inside him. Anger at her, at the military, at the world. Nathan hadn't made it back, but she had. And it wasn't fair. Peter leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. His mind drifted to the last conversation he had with Nathan before his deployment. They had argued about politics, about the military, about everything. Peter hadn't understood why Nathan felt so strongly about serving. To Peter, the world had seemed too divided, too corrupt, for one soldier to make a difference. But Nathan had believed in something bigger. "You don't get it, Dad," Nathan had said, his voice filled with that youthful conviction that Peter had never been able to understand. "It's not just about the uniform. It's about the people I serve with. We've got each other's backs, no matter where we come from." Peter hadn't known how to respond at the time. All he could think was that his son was walking into danger. And for what? A belief in something Peter had never fully grasped. And then, just like that, Nathan had been gone, killed by an IED while on patrol. All those arguments, all those conversations had felt meaningless after that. The grief was still raw, still consuming, and in moments like these it came back with a vengeance, fueling his bitterness and resentment. He hadn't processed it, not really. Instead, he had let it fester, lashing out at anyone who reminded him of his loss. Peter opened his eyes and glanced up the aisle toward her seat. She had handled his outburst with a grace he hadn't expected. He had seen the surprise in her eyes when he challenged her, but she hadn't fought back. She had stood her ground, but there had been no anger in her voice. She had simply existed, doing what she had a right to do. That realization gnawed at him now. The flight attendant came by, offering drinks. Peter declined, shaking his head. He wasn't thirsty. He wasn't anything but angry and sad, and he didn't know what to do with those emotions. As the flight settled into its cruising altitude, Peter closed his eyes again, trying to will the tension out of his body. But all he could think about was the letter he had found in Nathan's belongings after he died. A letter addressed to Peter, never sent. It had been a simple note, full of hope, about Nathan's belief in the good he could do. "I know you don't understand why I'm doing this," Nathan had written, But I need you to know that I believe in it. I believe in the people I'm serving with, in the bonds we built, and I believe that one day you'll understand that too." Peter had never been able to read it without breaking down. The words felt like a challenge, one he hadn't been able to live up to. And here he was, still angry, still hurting, still unwilling to accept what his son had stood for. He sighed deeply, feeling the weight of his grief settle heavily in his chest. He had taken that anger out on Emily Foster. And for what? Because she wore a uniform? Because she reminded him of Nathan? It wasn't right. He knew that. But knowing didn't make it any easier. Emily stared out the small airplane window, watching the endless expanse of clouds beneath them. Her mind kept drifting back to the man, Peter Langston. His words had stung, but they weren't unfamiliar. She had faced prejudice in many forms over the years, both subtle and overt. It didn't matter where she was or what she did. Some people just saw her uniform before they saw her. They made assumptions, quick judgments. The truth was she had grown used to it, but it didn't mean it hurt any less. Emily's hand brushed the small notebook she kept in her backpack. She had started writing letters over the past year as a way to cope with the stress of deployment. There had been so many times when her words had been her only outlet, her only way of processing the chaos around her. And now, sitting in this airplane seat thousands of feet above the ground, she felt that same need to write. She pulled the notebook out of her bag, flipping it open to a blank page. Her pen hovered over the paper for a moment before she began to write. "Dear Mr. Langston." She hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I understand that seeing someone in uniform must have stirred something painful for you. I don't know what you've been through, but I can see it's heavy. I want you to know that I don't hold any anger toward you for what happened. I've seen too many people hurting to let this moment define you. I don't know if you'll read this, but if you do, I hope it helps you understand something. Wearing this uniform doesn't make me any different from you. We all carry our burdens, and we all find ways to keep going. For me, this uniform is more than just a job. It's a way of serving something bigger than myself. And the people I've served with, they're like family. That's something I think your son, wherever he is, would understand." Emily paused, her pen still, as the hum of the plane's engines filled the quiet space around her. She didn't know if Peter would ever see this letter. She didn't know if he even cared. But writing it gave her a sense of peace, a way to turn the ugly confrontation into something meaningful. Maybe, she thought, this was her way of coping with the pain they both carried. She closed the notebook and tucked it back into her bag. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, jolting slightly, but Emily remained calm. Her training had taught her to stay steady in the face of uncertainty, to trust that things would eventually smooth out. As she settled back into her seat, she made a silent promise to herself. When the flight landed, she would find a way to give Peter that letter. Maybe it wouldn't change anything, but maybe, just maybe, it would. As the plane touched down in Seattle, Emily Foster felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The familiar weight of her military backpack felt lighter as she gathered her belongings. The flight had been long, but the real journey, she knew, was just beginning. Returning home after deployment always brought a strange mix of emotions, joy but also uncertainty. Walking through the terminal, she scanned the faces of travelers, some rushing to catch their flights, others embracing loved ones. Her heart raced as she thought about her family waiting for her. She spotted them before they saw her. Her mom, Laura, her dad, Jack, and her younger brother, Josh. They stood near the entrance, holding a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, Captain Foster," adorned with red, white, and blue balloons. The moment her eyes met hers, Laura let out a small cry and rushed forward, wrapping Emily in a tight hug. "You're home," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're finally home." Emily hugged her back, the tension of the past year starting to melt away. Her dad and brother soon joined, surrounding her in a warm embrace. After a few moments, they all pulled back, smiles lighting up their faces. "Look at you," Jack said, his voice full of pride as he eyed her uniform. "Our hero." "Welcome home, sis," Josh added, playfully punching her in the arm. "We missed you." Emily chuckled softly, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the flight, specifically to Peter Langston. She had the letter she wrote to him tucked into her bag, still unsure if she would ever have the chance to give it to him. That moment on the plane, the tension, the brief but heavy confrontation, hung over her even as she embraced her family. As they made their way to the car, Laura noticed Emily's quietness. "Are you okay, honey? You seem a little distracted." Emily hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had happened on the plane. "Yeah," she said, smiling at her mom. "It's just a lot to process. Being back home after so long." Her mother nodded, clearly understanding. "Well, we're just happy to have you home. I've cooked all your favorite meals. You must be starving." The car ride home was filled with chatter about family updates and small talk about the weather, but Emily's mind kept drifting back to Peter. She hadn't realized how much his words had affected her until now. Despite all the danger and challenges she'd faced overseas, it was these small moments of misunderstanding and prejudice that could hurt the most. As they pulled into the driveway of her family's modest home, Emily spotted the "Welcome Home" banner hanging on the front porch. She felt a surge of emotion. This was the place that grounded her, the place where she could be herself without judgment or expectation. But even as she walked into the familiar warmth of her home, Peter Langston's face and harsh words lingered in her mind. Peter Langston sat in his darkened living room, the silence of his house overwhelming. He had returned home a few hours earlier, still replaying the encounter with Emily Foster on the plane in his mind. The embarrassment, the shame, it all twisted inside him, gnawing at his conscience. He hadn't meant to snap at her, hadn't meant to let his grief overtake his reason, but seeing that uniform, seeing her standing there so calm and composed, had brought everything crashing back. Nathan, his son, the war, the day he'd been told Nathan wasn't coming home. Peter leaned forward, rubbing his temples, trying to block out the memories that flooded him. The grief was still raw, even after 2 years. Nathan had been his pride and joy, the son who believed in something bigger than himself, and now he was gone. The guilt followed Peter everywhere. He had never supported Nathan's decision to join the military. Their arguments had been bitter, often leaving Peter feeling like he didn't understand his own son. And now that final argument replayed in his mind over and over. Nathan had been so passionate, so determined. "I'm doing this because I believe in it, Dad," Nathan had said, frustration clear in his voice. "You don't understand, but that doesn't change the fact that this is who I am." Peter had wanted to respond, had wanted to support him, but all he could think about was the danger, the risks. He had lost his brother in the Vietnam War, and the fear of losing Nathan had made him lash out. And then Nathan had died, and Peter was left with nothing but regret. Peter stood and walked over to the small wooden box on the mantel, the one containing Nathan's medals and letters. He opened it gently, pulling out the letter Nathan had written before his final deployment. He had never sent it, but it had been among his things when they were returned to Peter after Nathan's death. Peter unfolded the letter, his hands trembling slightly as he read the familiar words. "Dad, I know you don't get why I'm doing this, but I need you to understand something. It's not just about fighting or serving. It's about the people I'm doing it with. They're my family too. We've built something strong, something that transcends where we're from or what we look like. Out there, we're all the same. And I believe one day you'll understand that." The letter had always been hard for Peter to read, but tonight, after the encounter with Emily Foster, it felt even heavier. He had lashed out at her, let his grief manifest as anger, and he hated himself for it. Nathan would have been disappointed in him. His son had believed in building bridges, in connecting with others, regardless of background or differences. And Peter had done the opposite. He had let his own pain cloud his judgment. Sitting back down in his chair, Peter stared at the letter, his heart aching. Nathan's words echoed in his mind. "Out there, we're all the same." Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the table beside him, breaking through the silence. He picked it up, surprised to see a notification for a new message from a name he didn't recognize. His brow furrowed as he opened the message, only to see that it was from Emily Foster. She had found him through a mutual connection on social media. "Mr. Langston, I wanted to reach out and apologize if our interaction on the plane upset you. I understand that seeing me in uniform may have stirred painful memories. I hope you know that my intention was never to hurt you. I wrote something on the flight that I'd like to share with you. If you're open to it, I'd like to talk." Peter's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected to hear from her. He certainly hadn't expected her to be the one apologizing. A flood of emotions hit him. Guilt, sadness, and surprisingly, a faint glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a chance to make things right. Back home in Seattle, Captain Emily Foster found herself slowly adjusting to the rhythm of civilian life. The quiet of her family home, the scent of her mother's cooking, and the warm embrace of familiar surroundings should have comforted her, but her mind remained elsewhere. Each day she relived the moments from the plane with Peter Langston, questioning whether she should have done something different. It was only a few days after her return when Mr. Harrison, a family friend and owner of a local security firm, reached out to her. He had been a friend of her father's for years and had always supported veterans. "Emily," he greeted her warmly on the phone, "I heard you're back home. We've missed you around here. I know you've just come off deployment, but I wanted to talk to you about a job opportunity." Emily's heart raced. She had expected to take some time to settle in, to think about her next steps, but the offer caught her off guard. She knew that many veterans struggled with the transition to civilian life, and she didn't want to fall into that trap. The thought of going back to the daily grind, the structure of a security job, had its appeal, but was it what she really wanted? "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Emily replied. "What exactly did you have in mind?" "I'm expanding the company," Mr. Harrison said, "and I need someone who understands leadership, someone with real-world experience. You'd be perfect to help train new recruits, help them adjust to working in the civilian world. You've got a unique set of skills, and I know you can make a difference." Emily chewed her lip, considering his words. The offer was tempting: stability, structure, and a way to continue serving in a different capacity. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else she was supposed to do. Her mind kept drifting back to Peter's message. She hadn't responded yet, uncertain how to proceed, but the need to connect felt stronger than ever. "I'll think about it," she finally said. "I'm not ready to jump into anything just yet." "I understand," Mr. Harrison replied, his voice kind. "Take your time. The offer will be here when you're ready." As Emily hung up the phone, she felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Her family had always supported her military career, but now that she was home, they expected her to settle into a civilian life again. Her brother Josh had even mentioned casually, "You know, it'd be nice to have you around for a while. Maybe find something local, not so dangerous." But what was home to her now? The sense of duty and purpose that had driven her through her deployment was still there, but she wasn't sure if a security job would fulfill it. She felt torn between two worlds, the one she'd left behind in the military and the new one awaiting her at home. Her thoughts turned back to Peter Langston and his message. She had considered sending him the letter she'd written on the plane, but wasn't sure if it was the right time. What would he think? Would he even care? Emily had seen many forms of grief during her deployment, but Peter's pain was different. It was personal, raw, and unresolved. Maybe, she thought, reaching out to him would help them both. Peter Langston sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. The message from Emily Foster blinked back at him, unanswered. He had read it multiple times, struggling with what to say. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to bury his emotions like he always did. But another part, a quieter, more rational part, knew that this might be the opportunity he had been searching for. For years, Peter had wrestled with guilt and anger over his son Nathan's death. The grief had consumed him, making him distant from friends, from family, from everyone who tried to help him process his loss. But Emily's message had stirred something in him, a reminder that his son had served with people just like her, people who were trying to make sense of a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. After hours of pacing and thinking, Peter sat down at the table, determined to write a response. He tapped out the words carefully, unsure of how they would be received. "Captain Foster, I wasn't expecting to hear from you, but I'm glad you reached out. I owe you an apology for the way I behaved on the plane. The truth is, I lost my son Nathan in combat 2 years ago, and seeing you in uniform brought back all the pain and anger I've been carrying since then. I don't expect you to understand or forgive me, but I do appreciate your kindness. You mentioned wanting to talk, and I think I'd like that. There's a lot I need to say, and maybe it's time I try to say it. If you're willing, let me know when you're free, and we can meet. Sincerely, Peter Langston." He hesitated before hitting send, wondering if he was doing the right thing. But deep down, Peter knew he couldn't continue living with the burden of his anger and guilt. He had lost Nathan, but maybe by talking to Emily, he could begin to make peace with it. An hour passed before Emily's response came. "Peter, thank you for your message. I'd be glad to meet and talk whenever it's convenient for you. I think we both have things to say that might help us understand each other. Let's plan to meet at the cafe downtown this Saturday at 10 a.m. if that works for you." Peter stared at the screen for a moment, then typed his reply. "Saturday works. I'll see you then." As he set the phone down, Peter felt a strange mixture of dread and hope. The confrontation on the plane had left him shaken, but now he had the chance to do something about it. Maybe this was the first step in finding closure, not just for himself, but for his son's memory too. Saturday morning arrived with the crispness of early fall. The sun peeked through the Seattle skyline as Emily Foster walked toward the small coffee shop downtown. She felt a nervous energy in her stomach as she approached the cafe where she and Peter Langston had agreed to meet. Her military training had prepared her for a lot of things: danger, survival, leadership, but nothing had quite prepared her for moments like this, where emotions ran deep and every word carried weight. She paused just outside the cafe door, taking a deep breath to steady herself before stepping inside. The rich aroma of fresh coffee hit her senses immediately, calming her slightly. She scanned the room and spotted Peter sitting at a corner table by the window, his hands wrapped around a mug, staring out at the street. Emily's heart pounded as she made her way toward him. As she approached, Peter glanced up, and their eyes met. He looked older than he had on the plane, more tired, more worn. There was something in his gaze that spoke of a man carrying years of unresolved pain. "Peter," Emily greeted him quietly as she reached the table. He nodded, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Emily, thanks for coming." She sat down, offering a small, tentative smile. "Thanks for inviting me." They sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Peter cleared his throat, glancing down at his coffee before finally speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about our flight," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "About what I said. I was out of line." Emily shook her head gently. "You were grieving. It's not easy to think clearly in those moments." Peter's gaze flickered with surprise. He hadn't expected her to offer him such grace. "Still, it doesn't excuse the way I acted." Emily took a sip of her coffee, setting the cup down before responding. "We've all said things we regret. I've seen people in war zones say and do things that weren't truly them. Pain does that to people." Peter leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "It's just, when I saw you in uniform, I couldn't stop thinking about Nathan, my son. He wore that same uniform, and now he's gone. I'm sorry for your loss," Emily said sincerely. "I can't imagine what you've been through." Peter shook his head, his voice strained. "I've spent the last 2 years angry at everything. The world, the military, myself. Nathan and we saw eye to eye on his decision to enlist. I thought he was throwing his life away, and now I'm stuck with all this guilt." Emily listened intently, letting him speak without interruption. She had seen grief like this before, but hearing it from Peter's perspective brought a deeper understanding of the man behind the anger. "I know it's not your fault," Peter continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know that. But when I saw you, it was like all that pain came rushing back, and I didn't know what to do with it." Emily nodded, her eyes soft with compassion. "I understand, and I know that what happened to Nathan isn't something that words can fix, but I do believe that talking about it, understanding each other, can help." Peter looked at her, his expression torn between sadness and relief. "I read your letter," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I didn't expect to. But once I started, I couldn't stop. The way you wrote about your experience, about the bonds you formed with your fellow soldiers, it reminded me of some of the things Nathan used to say. He talked about the people he served with like they were his family. I never understood it then." Emily smiled faintly. "That's because they are family. Out there, we rely on each other for everything. Our lives, our sanity, our survival. It's a bond that goes deeper than blood." Peter's eyes glistened as he nodded slowly. "I wish I had listened to him more when he was alive. I wish I hadn't been so set in my ways, so convinced that his choices were wrong." Emily reached across the table. placing her hand gently on Peter's. You can't change the past, Peter, but you can still honor his memory by understanding now, by doing something with that understanding. Peter stared at her hand for a moment, then looked up, his voice thick with emotion. How? Emily pulled her hand back and sat up straighter, the weight of the moment settling over her. Nathan believed in the bonds he built, in the people he served with. You can honor that by supporting veterans, by helping others see the value in what Nathan fought for. Peter blinked, his expression softening. How can I do that? Well, Emily said, there are organizations, support groups for veterans and their families. They need people like you, people who have been through loss, who understand the cost of service. You could help others heal by sharing your story, by being there for those who might be going through what you went through. Peter nodded slowly, considering her words. I don't know if I'm ready. You don't have to be ready right now, Emily assured him. But when you are, it's something to think about. The conversation flowed more easily after that. Peter spoke more about Nathan, his passion for the military, his humor, his determination. Emily shared her own stories from the field, talking about the soldiers she had served with, the sacrifices they had made, and the camaraderie they had built. By the time they finished their coffee, there was a sense of understanding between them, a bridge that had been built through shared grief and honest conversation. As they stood to leave, Peter looked at Emily, his expression lighter than it had been when they first sat down. Thank you for this, Emily. I didn't realize how much I needed to talk. Emily smiled. I'm glad we did. Peter hesitated for a moment, then asked, Do you think I could come to one of those support groups you mentioned? Emily nodded, her heart lifting at his request. Of course. I'll make sure to let you know when the next one is. You'd be more than welcome. They exchanged contact information, and as Peter walked away, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. It hadn't been an easy conversation, but it was a necessary one. She had faced her own doubts and found a way to connect with someone who had been suffering in silence for too long. The bridge was built. Now it was time to see where it would lead. 2 weeks later, Emily found herself sitting in the community center, waiting for the Veteran Support Group meeting to begin. She had been volunteering with the group since she'd returned from deployment, helping veterans adjust to civilian life. It was a space where people could talk openly about their experiences, their struggles, and their triumphs without fear of judgment. The room slowly filled with familiar faces, other veterans she had come to know and respect. The air was warm with the scent of coffee, and the sound of quiet conversations filled the space. But Emily was particularly anxious about this meeting because Peter Langston had agreed to come. When Peter walked in, Emily saw the uncertainty in his eyes. He looked around the room, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, clearly unsure of what to expect. Emily waved him over, offering him a reassuring smile. Hey, Peter, she greeted him as he sat down beside her. I'm glad you made it. Peter nodded, his eyes scanning the room. I wasn't sure if I'd come, he admitted, but something about what we talked about stuck with me. I think Nathan would want me to be here. The group leader, Mark, a fellow veteran, began the meeting by welcoming everyone. As the group moved through introductions, the tone was warm and open, with each person sharing a bit about themselves. When it was Peter's turn, he hesitated, glancing at Emily for support. She gave him an encouraging nod. My name is Peter Langston, he began, his voice low but steady. I'm not a veteran myself, but my son was. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan before he was killed 2 years ago. I've been struggling with that ever since. The room fell silent as Peter spoke, and Emily saw the understanding in the eyes of those around them. They knew the weight of his words. They had felt it too. I came here because I want to understand more, Peter continued, his voice growing stronger. I didn't agree with my son's decision to enlist, but I realize now that it wasn't about whether I agreed. It was about supporting him. I didn't do that when he was alive, but I want to find a way to do it now. There was a moment of silence before Mark spoke up. We're glad you're here, Peter. This is a space for everyone who's been touched by military service, whether you wore the uniform or not. Your story matters just as much as anyone else's. The rest of the meeting continued, and as Peter listened to the other veterans share their stories, Emily saw the tension in his body slowly begin to ease. By the time the meeting ended, Peter looked more at peace than Emily had ever seen him. As they walked out together, Peter turned to Emily. Thank you for inviting me to this. It's the first time I've felt, I don't know, lighter in a long time. Emily smiled warmly. I'm glad. It's what Nathan would have wanted. Peter nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. Yeah, I think so too. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Peter's conversations became more frequent. After that first veteran support group meeting, Peter found himself attending regularly, drawn to the camaraderie and the sense of belonging he had never realized he needed. Slowly but surely, he started to open up about Nathan, about his own grief, and the regrets that had weighed him down for years. Emily, for her part, saw this as a new beginning, not just for Peter, but for herself too. Her time in the military had given her leadership and purpose, but since coming home, she had struggled with where to direct that energy. Working with the veteran support group helped her feel grounded again, and her connection with Peter had opened her eyes to a new way of serving. It was during one of these support group sessions that Emily had an idea. We should hold an event, she said one evening after the meeting had ended. Peter and a few other veterans lingered, sipping coffee and chatting. Emily's voice caught their attention. Something that brings veterans and civilians together, something that shows the community what we stand for. Mark, the group leader, raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you have in mind? Emily leaned forward, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. We could host a panel discussion, get veterans to share their stories with civilians. So many people don't understand what it's like to serve, and I think if we bring those two worlds together, we could build some bridges, show people that veterans are more than just their service, that we're all part of the same community. The group murmured in agreement, nodding as Emily laid out her plan. Peter, sitting quietly beside her, smiled. He had seen Emily's passion for this project grow over the past few weeks, and he admired how determined she was to make a difference. You could speak, Peter, Emily suggested, turning to him. I know you've got a story to tell. Your perspective, as a father who lost a son in combat, would be powerful. People need to hear it. Peter's eyes widened in surprise. Me? I don't know if I'm ready for that. You've come a long way already, Emily said gently. You don't have to give a speech. Just share your story. It could help someone going through the same thing. Peter hesitated, glancing around at the others. He could see the encouragement in their eyes, and part of him knew that Emily was right. He had been carrying this pain for too long, and maybe it was time to do something with it. I'll think about it, he finally said. Emily smiled, satisfied with his answer. That's all I ask. As the group dispersed for the night, Emily began putting her plan into action. She contacted local organizations, veterans groups, and community leaders, laying the groundwork for the event. She secured a venue at the local community center and worked tirelessly to ensure everything would come together. The weeks leading up to the event were a whirlwind of activity, and soon the day arrived. The community center buzzed with energy. The event had drawn a larger crowd than Emily had anticipated, with people from all walks of life, veterans, civilians, families, filling the room. The air was thick with anticipation, and Emily could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She stood at the back of the room, watching as the audience settled into their seats. On stage, a row of chairs was set up for the panelists, all veterans who had agreed to share their stories. Peter stood near the stage, looking nervous but resolute. He had agreed to speak despite his earlier reservations, and Emily couldn't have been prouder. As the lights dimmed and the event began, Emily took a deep breath, her heart racing with excitement and nerves. The moderator introduced the panelists one by one, and soon the veterans began to share their experiences. The stories were raw, emotional, and powerful. Veterans talked about the struggles of reintegrating into civilian life, the mental health challenges they had faced, and the deep bonds they had formed with their fellow soldiers. The audience listened intently, many nodding and understanding, others wiping away tears as the veterans spoke. When it was Peter's turn to speak, Emily held her breath. He stepped up to the microphone, his hands trembling slightly as he looked out at the crowd. My name is Peter Langston, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I'm not a veteran myself, but my son Nathan was. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and he gave his life for this country. I've spent the last 2 years angry at the world, angry at myself, and angry at the military. But that anger didn't bring him back. It just kept me stuck. Peter paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I was wrong to judge my son's decision to serve, just like I was wrong to judge the men and women who wear that uniform. My son believed in something bigger than himself, and I see now that his service was part of who he was. And it's taken me a long time to realize that I can't change what happened, but I can honor his memory by understanding what he believed in. As Peter spoke, the room fell silent. His words cut through the noise, reaching into the hearts of everyone present. Emily felt her throat tighten with emotion as she watched Peter confront his grief head-on. I'm still learning, Peter said, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm here today because I want to be part of the healing. I want to be part of the bridge between veterans and civilians, because I believe that's what Nathan would have wanted. There was a long pause after Peter finished speaking, and then the room erupted into applause. The sound was deafening, but it wasn't just about the clapping. It was about what Peter had shared. His vulnerability, his willingness to admit his mistakes, had touched something deep within the crowd. As Peter stepped off the stage, Emily rushed over to him, her eyes filled with pride. That was incredible, she said softly. You did it. Peter smiled, the weight that had once burdened him seeming to lift. I didn't think I could, but you were right. It feels good to let it out, to share it. The rest of the event continued with more veterans sharing their stories, but the moment that stood out the most was Peter's speech. It wasn't just about the words, it was about the healing that had taken place, the bridge that had been built. By the time the event ended, the atmosphere in the room was one of unity. Veterans and civilians mingled, talking, sharing, and understanding each other in ways that hadn't been possible before. Emily watched it all unfold, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This was why she had returned home, to continue serving, not through combat, but through connection. As the evening wound down, Peter approached Emily once more, this time with a different kind of smile on his face, one that spoke of hope. You've done something amazing here, Emily, he said. Nathan would have been proud. Emily felt tears well up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, her voice steady. We did this together, Peter, you and me. Peter nodded, his eyes glistening. Yeah, I guess we did. The days following the event at the community center were a blur of congratulations and reflection. Emily Foster felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that what she had set in motion was already having a profound impact. People from the event had reached out, sharing how much it had opened their eyes to the lives of veterans, to the personal stories they had never been exposed to before. But now, as the excitement began to settle, Emily was left with a decision that had been weighing on her since she first returned home. Sitting at the kitchen table one morning, Emily's thoughts drifted back to the job offer from Mr. Harrison. The opportunity to work with his security firm was still on the table, and her family had been gently nudging her to take it. They wanted her close, safe, and settled. It made sense. After all, working in a structured environment, training new recruits, and using her military experience in a different way seemed like a logical next step. But something about it didn't feel right. Emily's mind wandered to the Veterans Support Group, to the events she and Peter had organized, and to the countless lives she had seen change simply through conversation, through the act of listening and understanding. That, she realized, was where her true passion lay. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Peter standing on the porch, a slight smile on his face. He had been stopping by more often since the event, and they had grown closer, bonded by their shared mission of healing. Hey, Peter, Emily greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. What brings you by? Peter held up a small piece of paper. I've been thinking about something. I want to keep going with what we started. Emily raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you mean? Peter sat down at the kitchen table, the paper still in his hand. I've been talking to some of the people from the support group, and there's interest in doing more events like the one we just had. Not just locally, but expanding it. Other towns, other communities. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had thought about doing more events, but hearing Peter talk about it like this made it feel like more than just a dream. You really think we could do that? Peter nodded. I think we have to. The impact we made here, people need to hear these stories. They need to know what veterans go through, and veterans need a space to heal and connect. What we started isn't just a one-time thing. It's bigger than that. Emily stared at him for a moment, processing his words. The sense of purpose she had been searching for suddenly felt clearer than ever. This wasn't just about one event or one conversation. It was about creating a movement, a bridge that could connect veterans and civilians across communities. Peter handed her the paper. It was a proposal, a rough outline of how they could structure future events, reach out to sponsors, and continue building their network. "I've been thinking about this for a while," Peter said, "and I know we can make it work." Emily smiled, her decision finally solidifying in her mind. She wouldn't be taking the security job. Her new mission was here, in her community, with people like Peter. "I'm in," she said, her voice firm. "Let's do it." Peter grinned, relief and excitement washing over him. "Good, because I've already started reaching out to some people." As they sat together, planning out the details, Emily felt a sense of clarity and peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. The path ahead wasn't entirely clear, but she knew that she was on the right one, and she wasn't walking it alone. Several months later, Emily stood at the podium of another packed event, this time in a neighboring town. The room was full of people, veterans, their families, and civilians from all walks of life, eager to hear the stories being shared. The air buzzed with the same energy that had filled the community center back in Seattle. But this time, the scope was even bigger. Peter sat in the front row, watching with quiet pride. He had become a key part of the initiative, not only sharing his own story, but also helping to recruit other veterans to join the cause. His grief, while still present, had transformed into something else, something constructive, something that honored Nathan's memory by helping others heal. As Emily looked out at the crowd, she felt the same surge of purpose she had experienced at the first event. This was her mission now, to continue building bridges between veterans and civilians, to bring understanding where there had once been distance, and to create spaces where healing could happen. She took a deep breath and began her speech. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Foster, and today I want to talk to you about the power of stories. In my time in the military, I learned that the bonds we form with our fellow soldiers are some of the strongest we will ever experience. But when we come home, those bonds are often misunderstood by the people around us. They see the uniform, but they don't see the person inside it." The audience was quiet, listening intently. "We started these events because we wanted to change that," Emily continued. "We wanted to show that veterans are not just defined by their service, but by their humanity. We wanted to create a space where veterans and civilians could connect, understand each other, and build a community that bridges the divide between us." She glanced over at Peter, who nodded encouragingly. "And it's working," Emily said, her voice growing stronger. "With each event, we see the walls coming down. We see people listening, learning, and healing. And that's what this is about. It's about healing together as one community." The room erupted into applause, and Emily stepped back from the podium, her heart swelling with emotion. She had found her new path, and it was everything she had hoped for. As the event came to a close, Peter approached her, clapping her on the shoulder. "You did good, Emily." She smiled at him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "We did good, Peter." Together they watched as the audience slowly filed out, people stopping to talk, to ask questions, to connect in ways that hadn't been possible before. The room was filled with hope for future, for understanding, and for the bridges that would continue to be built. As the last rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, Emily felt a profound sense of peace. She had found her purpose, and it was one that went beyond her military service. It was a purpose that would carry her forward for years to come, fueled by the belief that understanding and compassion could change the world. And as long as there were bridges to build, she knew she would be there. One conversation, one connection, one heart at a time. If you enjoyed this story and found it as thrilling and captivating as I did, please consider hitting that subscribe button to stay updated with more incredible tales like this one. By subscribing, you'll never miss out on any new stories, and you'll be the first to experience the twists and turns of every adventure. Don't forget to turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon so you're always in the loop when new content drops. Your support truly helps this channel grow and allows me to continue creating stories that inspire, entertain, and connect us all. Thanks for being a part of this journey. Join our community and let's continue exploring together.